What is the darkest secret you found out about a family member? Let's find out. Story 1. Not really a secret, but definitely something strange. Back in the late 1960s, my maternal grandmother's husband divorced her and gave her partial custody of their 2 sons. During one of her scheduled visits, she took the boys and moved from North Dakota to California. Her entire family was part of the Seventh-day Adventist faith, a very close-knit community. So when she relocated, she chose a place in California with a strong Adventist presence, knowing the community would shield her from law enforcement. It's worth mentioning that her ex-husband was never accused of abuse. She was simply upset that she didn't have full custody. This situation went on from about 1968 to 1971. Eventually, she had a falling out with either her adoptive mother or a cousin, and they contacted her ex-husband, who then came and took the boys back. She didn't face jail time for taking the children, but she lost all visitation rights. As far as we know, she hasn't seen them since 1971. Later on, the Adventist Church introduced her to another church member, who became my grandfather. My mom and aunts have never met their half-brothers. Edit. It wasn't exactly a hidden secret, just something no one really talked about. In fact, my grandmother used to mention them constantly, even in her old age. According to my mom, she kept a framed photo of the boys walking away from her. The story goes that they didn't enjoy living with her, and when their father arrived to take them, they walked away without even glancing back. Story 2. When my dad was just 15, one of his friends took his own life right in front of him and some other friends. They were all hanging out, having fun at the friend's house, when suddenly the friend went upstairs, grabbed his dad's pistol, and came back down, asking everyone to pay attention. Then he put the gun to his head, pulled the trigger, and collapsed behind the couch. At first, they all thought it was some sick joke, until they looked behind the couch and saw the truth. I first heard this story from my mom when I turned 18, and it helped explain my dad's strange discomfort with toy guns when I was growing up. I never mentioned it to him, hoping he would one day bring it up himself. He eventually did, though we haven't discussed it since. It's amazing that he turned out to be such a kind, grounded man despite experiencing something so traumatic at such a young age. But he says the memory never really left him. He still has nightmares about it, and gets deeply unsettled whenever TV shows or films depict someone being shot in the head. Story 3. I'm not sure if this qualifies as a true family secret, since my mom grew up in a small town where everyone probably knew. But here's the story. My great-grandmother passed away when my grandma was just 4, and their father remarried a woman who already had children of her own. This new step-grandmother was horribly abusive. She would beat my grandma and her siblings as soon as their father left the house. She'd lock them in the basement all day and treat them terribly. This trauma left deep emotional scars, and my grandma ended up raising her own kids the same way. One of my great-uncles turned to alcohol and eventually developed a bizarre obsession with robbing graves, mainly for gold teeth, but also for jewelry and anything valuable he could trade for alcohol. My mom remembers him showing up at their back door, filthy and exhausted. Her mother would clean him up and feed him, but he'd always disappear again, back to the same life. My mom told me for years that he died in some kind of accident. But a few years ago, one of my uncles revealed the truth. He was found passed out on someone's lawn. The police were called, and when they tried to arrest him, he woke up and resisted. During the struggle, the police ended up killing him. Story 4. My brother and I were just little kids, 7 and 3, when this happened. We were taking a bath with our mom when we heard a loud bang coming from the living room, where our dad had been watching TV. We both started crying as our mom ran out to check on him. She came back quickly, tears streaming down her face, and told us not to worry. She explained that our dad had accidentally fired his gun, thinking someone was breaking in. Being so young, we accepted her explanation without question. After we got out of the bath, we went to see our dad. He was sitting there, still alive, and gave us both huge hugs. He explained again that he thought there was a burglar, and even showed us the bullet hole in the couch, the chip in the tile floor, and the flattened bullet itself. It wasn't until years later that I realized what had really happened. My dad had planned to end his life that day, right there on the couch. But something, maybe the sound of our voices, made him change his mind at the last second, and he fired into the couch instead. My mom must have understood what he tried to do, and came up with a cover story to protect us. Looking back, it explains that massive, tearful hug he gave us afterward. Thankfully, he never tried anything like that again. Today, he's 6'5" and doing just fine. Story 5. To sum it up, my great-great-grandmother's first husband, who fathered 5 of her children, refused to stop seeing another woman in town. Eventually, that woman became pregnant, and her family pressured him to take responsibility. The solution was that he would leave my great-great-grandmother, marry the other woman, and in return, her family would give my great-great-grandmother a large piece of land known as the Hill. She later remarried and had 4 more children, one of whom became my grandmother. Fast forward nearly a century, and the ownership of the Hill became complicated. All of the original siblings had passed away, leaving no clear records of who owned what. Then a drilling company discovered a huge natural gas reserve beneath the land. All of the great-grandchildren were contacted and asked to sign over the mineral rights in exchange for regular royalty checks. Now every so often, we all get updates on how much gas has been extracted, and the checks still come in. It's a strange but true family legacy, land traded for a broken marriage, now producing income generations later. Story 6. When I was 3, my dad tried to harm us, maybe even end our lives. My little brother had always been sickly, with breathing problems that sometimes meant rushing to the hospital. One day, my mom told my dad that my brother needed medicine again. He didn't want to give her any money, but offered to go buy it himself. While my mom got us kids ready for a trip to the pharmacy, my dad insisted we stay home and let my 4-year-old sister watch us. My mom refused and packed us into the car. While driving, my dad suddenly appeared behind us in his car and began ramming ours, trying to force us off the road into a deep ditch. The ditch was steep enough that flipping the car could have seriously injured or killed all of us. My older sister screamed out the window, and a random stranger driving by yelled at my dad, threatening to call the police, and said he'd step in if they didn't. Eventually, my dad drove away. My mom pulled over, sobbing, and called my grandma. My grandma then phoned my dad and said that if he ever tried anything like that again, she'd make sure he regretted it for life. I didn't learn any of this until my 23rd birthday, when my grandma told me the story after I was upset over a breakup. Quite a birthday surprise, huh? Story 7. Mine isn't as intense as some others, but it still left a mark. My dad died when I was young, and my mom struggled to raise me. So I went to live overseas with my father's sister, my aunt. We stayed in touch with my mom through the years, phone calls, visits, and even grew close for a while. When she was in the final stages of cancer, she started saying odd things, talking about pine cones in Finland, drifting in and out of clarity. That's when my mom's sister started bringing up financial matters and inheritance. It felt wrong. My mom was still alive, and yet we were already talking about dividing her estate. My aunt warned me to be cautious around her sister, hinting at something that had caused a rift years ago between my parents. She wouldn't say what, though. She didn't want it to affect how I remembered them. After my mom passed, that same sister kept telling me not to worry about money, not to file anything. Later I found out she'd already filed on behalf of my grandfather, who technically was my mom's next of kin, making her eligible for a share of my mom's estate once he passed, which he did shortly afterward. Every time she contacted me, it was to ask for information to support her claim. I had to get a lawyer involved since I was living in a different country. Eventually, I asked my aunt to tell me the truth. That's when she finally admitted, years ago my aunt, the one filing for inheritance, and my dad had an affair. They even slept together while my mom and I were in the same house. It broke something in my mom, and now, with the inheritance battle, it made me see my aunt in a whole new light. Story 8. There are a few stories I could share, but here's one that really stands out. Back in the 1950s or 60s, one of my relatives, possibly my grandmother's cousin, took his dad's car out for a drive and crashed, dying instantly. The chilling part? He didn't know that his father had been working on the car and had disconnected the brakes. Now, my own story. When I was around 5, my mom kidnapped me from my father. She and her friends treated me terribly. There was neglect and abuse. When I turned 7, my dad won full custody. At first, he seemed like a good father, but as I got older, he became verbally cruel and resentful. Later, I learned my mom had another child before me with a different man. She mistreated that child too, forcing him to eat pet food from a dog bowl. He was eventually taken away from her. I also found out that my dad never actually wanted kids. My mom had stopped using birth control, so she could stay home instead of working. He'd come home from work to find me dirty, hungry, and the house a mess. He started blaming me for everything, saying he wished I'd never been born. This became one of those unspoken family stories. Anytime I tried to talk about it, they'd shut me down to protect the family image. I've since cut ties with all of them. Story 9. Not long ago, I started to wonder if my dad might have more kids than just my siblings and me. My parents got divorced when I was about 9, and honestly, it wasn't surprising. They never got along. My dad was always a bit shady, staying out late, keeping odd numbers on his phone. After the divorce, he insisted on keeping our birth certificates at his house, saying it was more secure. When I turned 14 and wanted to get my nose pierced, I needed mine. So we went to his place to get it. As he looked through his files, I noticed several names listed under his name, names like Marissa and John, ones I didn't recognize. He saw me notice and quickly shuffled through the papers faster until he pulled out mine. I didn't ask any questions at the time, but that image stuck with me. I'm planning to take a DNA test one day to find out if I have more siblings. I don't want to assume too much, but something about those names made me start questioning everything I thought I knew. Story 10. It all started when my uncle was dying of stage 4 lymphoma. In his final days, he begged me to take him out of the hospital and bring him home. He seemed desperate. I loved him dearly, but didn't fully understand why he was so adamant. 3 weeks later, he passed away without saying another word. While my mom and I were cleaning out his room, we found a locked box with a note taped on top that read, "Please throw away." Despite the warning, curiosity got the better of my mom, and she opened it. Inside were gay travel guides and photos of him alone in various places around the country. That's when we realized the truth. My uncle had been a closeted gay man his entire life. He had never told anyone, choosing instead to keep that part of himself hidden in a literal box. I've never forgotten the look in his eyes when he asked me to take him home. I think he wanted to destroy that box before anyone could find it. The weight of that shame must have been crushing. It broke my heart to think he never felt safe enough to share who he truly was. Story 11. My dad had a secret relationship and a daughter from it. She was born 3 years after I was. That in itself might not sound shocking, but how I found out made everything more complicated. Growing up, home life wasn't great. As soon as I turned 18, I left and never looked back, especially when it came to my dad. I joined the military, straightened out my life, and didn't keep in touch. He passed away while I was serving, and I didn't attend the funeral. After I got out, I started studying physics at a university in my home state. In one of my study groups, I met a girl named Mary. We clicked instantly. We had a lot in common, both a bit estranged from our families. We dated for nearly 2 years, even lived together, and talked about marriage. But eventually we broke up. Years later, I tried reconnecting with my mom, but it didn't go well. She was bitter, and after a stroke, her memory got scrambled. She thought I was her boyfriend from high school. We couldn't have real conversations anymore. Then came the twist. I took a 23andMe DNA test. The results showed I had a half-sister. I clicked on her profile and froze. It was Mary. She must have gotten the same notification because she reached out. On the phone, she said she never knew her dad's identity, only that he sent money now and then. I told her she hadn't missed much. We both agreed to keep our past relationship to ourselves. If anyone asks, we're just old friends from college. We've only talked a few times since, and honestly, I don't know if we ever will again. It's one of those things that makes you question your entire story. Story 12. I've recently started to suspect that my grandparents on my mother's side may have done something unthinkable, possibly even killing and eating people. In the 1950s, they eloped and ran off into the jungle, building a house from scratch like something out of Robinson Crusoe. My mom was born in that jungle home, delivered by my grandfather himself. As you can imagine, they were incredibly tough and self-sufficient. There were stories about bandits in nearby villages, and at one point, it's believed that the bandits found their house and kidnapped my mom when she was a baby. My grandparents never confirmed it, but they've dropped hints. Supposedly, they tracked the bandits down, killed most of them, and may have used their meat for food, since supplies in the jungle were hard to come by. When I visited as a kid, they warned me never to go near a particular mound near the house. Even now, if I ask about it, they say, "Dig it up after we're gone." I'm almost certain bones are buried there. There's more. When I was 4, my parents suddenly moved from my dad's country to my mom's. They left everything behind and never looked back. My father completely cut off his family. I've pieced together that he told them what my grandparents might have done, and they told him to leave us. But he chose to stay and was basically exiled from his side of the family. I still don't know the full truth. Maybe they were just messing with me. But even now, at 33, I can't shake the feeling there's something very dark buried in that story, literally and figuratively. Story 13. A long time ago, I learned that mental illness runs in my family, particularly the kind that causes hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and violent behavior. My aunt has it the worst. As a teenager, she was treated terribly. My grandmother used to lock her in her room every day and made her do chores like a servant. When she did escape, she'd go out, drink, use drugs, or end up pregnant. Eventually, she was diagnosed and committed to a psychiatric hospital in the 60s, where she remained until the mid-70s. After her release and with proper medication, she was placed on disability and monitored. Later, my mom discovered the most painful part. During her time in the institution, my aunt had been assaulted multiple times by staff. She couldn't report it. She couldn't even fully understand what was happening because of her condition. Today, she lives in a supervised home for people with similar challenges and is under the care of my mom and another aunt. It's heartbreaking to think about how she was failed, first by her own family, then by the system that was supposed to protect her. Story 14. I recently learned that my great-grandfather killed my great-grandmother. I never met him. He died before I was born. But growing up, I only heard kind things about him. My mom always described him as calm and caring. Then I found out the truth. During a drunken argument, he shot her. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. He had a history of being physically abusive. What shocked me even more was that no one ever reported it. No police, no consequences. It was swept under the rug, and he never served a single day in jail. Yes, it happened many decades ago when attitudes toward domestic violence were unfortunately very different. But still, it was a complete shock, especially because everyone had always spoken about him with such admiration. My mom told me he deeply regretted it for the rest of his life, always saying how much he missed her. But that doesn't erase what he did. It's hard to reconcile the image of the gentle man I grew up hearing about with the reality of who he actually was. Story 15. When I was a kid, I used to get teased a lot for coming from a big family. People would joke and call me a traveler, but I just thought it was a typical Irish thing. Big families were normal, right? Then, in 2019, I found out the horrifying truth. Many of my relatives are actually children born from abuse. My grandfather was a serial abuser. Looking back, I always had a sense that something wasn't right. My grandparents are wealthy millionaires, in fact, and they frequently gave money to their kids for therapy, rehab, and other needs. I thought it was generous. But it turns out it was hush money. I was the first grandchild, out of 30, who wasn't harmed by him. Of course, I didn't know that growing up. Every Christmas, the oldest grandchild got to use my grandfather's debit card, so we could all buy gifts. I thought it was just a sweet tradition. But again, it was all part of keeping quiet. In 2019, after years without new cases, the abuse started again, this time with the younger kids. That was the breaking point. The family couldn't stay silent anymore. They finally took action, determined to end the cycle. More victims have come forward, including people we didn't even know had been affected. It's been overwhelming, but also a relief. At least now, we know the truth, and healing can begin. Story 16. My great-grandfather rescued my great-grandmother from the Beer Canal concentration camp in 1945. He brought her back to Edinburgh, where they eventually got married and had my grandfather. My grandfather grew up idolizing his dad, believing he was a hard-working dock laborer who supported his family through honest means. He held that belief for decades, until everything changed. On his deathbed, my great-grandfather confessed to my grandfather that he wasn't just a dock worker. He had been part of a gang in Leith, robbing, hurting, even killing people. It was his way of clearing his conscience before he passed, but it completely shattered the image my grandfather had held of him his whole life. To make matters worse, it turned out that many people already knew about this side of him, everyone except my grandfather. As if that weren't enough, he also admitted to mistreating my great-grandmother throughout their entire marriage. The confession devastated the entire family. No one ever spoke about it again, and I only found out a couple of years ago. It was a hard truth to digest. The man my grandfather had seen as a hero was actually someone very different. Story 17. My dad is originally from Korea, and growing up, he never knew who his father was. When his mother married an American soldier, they moved to the United States, leaving the mystery behind. After my grandmother passed away last year, my dad got a call from his uncle in Korea. The uncle asked him to visit, saying he had a photo of my dad's father and was ready to reveal his identity, but only in person. He said he had kept the truth secret out of respect for my grandmother while she was alive. All of this stirred up difficult emotions. My dad always felt mistreated by his mom. She often blamed and criticized him unfairly. The new information made us wonder, why was his paternity such a tightly guarded secret? As my family talked it through, we started to suspect something deeply unsettling, that my dad's biological father might actually be his grandfather. When I cautiously brought this up to a cousin, she went completely silent. She didn't confirm it, but she didn't deny it either. My dad hasn't gone back to Korea. I think he's afraid of finding out the truth. Story 18. Growing up, I always knew I had an older sister. My mom spoke of her often and even had a tattoo with all her children's initials, including hers. I was told that when my mom had her, she was too young to care for a child, so adoption was the best choice. But as I got older, I discovered the real story. My mom was only 13 when she became pregnant by a 25-year-old man. She kept the pregnancy secret until she was far along. When my grandmother found out, she insisted my mom either give up the baby or leave home. She also threatened the man with legal consequences unless he signed away his rights. My grandmother arranged for one of her co-workers, who had been struggling to conceive, to adopt the baby. My mom reluctantly agreed, on the condition that her daughter be named Elle, and that there be updates and possible visits. But about a year later, my grandmother told the adoptive family that my mom wanted no further contact, cutting off all communication. Strangely, the child was still given the name Elle, even though no one passed it along. Years later, I found my sister on my 21st birthday. It turned out we'd lived in the same town for years, even bumped into each other without realizing it. Sadly, my mom couldn't accept the person her daughter had become and wanted nothing to do with her or her kids. Before my grandmother passed away, I drove her to a chemo appointment, and during that ride, she admitted her biggest regret was not forcing my mom to go through with an abortion. That confession left me stunned. It made me wonder what could have been if things had gone differently. Story 19. On my dad's 18th birthday, his parents sat him down and delivered a life-changing revelation. With no warning, they told him he was adopted. He didn't believe it at first, until his mom pulled out his birth certificate. Instead of her name, another woman was listed, and for the father's name, it just said R.A.P. His parents explained that they didn't know much, only that his biological mother was a very young girl who became pregnant through a traumatic situation and gave him up at birth. Then came the second shock. The woman who raised him wasn't even his first adoptive mother. His much older sister had originally adopted him as a baby, thinking motherhood would be easy. But after a few months, she gave up. Their parents, his adoptive grandparents, took him in instead, worried it would be too embarrassing to return him to the state. So his sister became his mother, and his actual mother became his aunt. He was completely stunned. And just when he was processing all that, they told him, "Now that you're 18, you should probably move out." Story 20. My story might not be as dramatic as some others, but it's still terrifying in its own way. I found out that my immediate family, led by my mother, was planning to have me declared mentally unfit and institutionalized. I have epilepsy, but it's well controlled. Even in severe cases, there's no reason someone should be permanently committed just for that. I also have a son, and it became clear that my mother's end goal was to take him away from me. I only discovered the plan because one of them accidentally copied me on an email thread. It was all their detailed steps on how they were going to build a case to make me seem unstable. At one point, I considered filing restraining orders, but how do you do that against your entire family? Instead, I confronted them directly. A few months later, a police officer showed up at my door after someone reported me for neglect. I invited him in, and he could see immediately that everything was fine. Though he couldn't say officially who made the report, I had a strong feeling it was my mom. Eventually, he confirmed it. Thankfully, I haven't had any more trouble since. But the idea that your own family could try to have you locked away, just to gain control, is something I'll never forget. Story 21. My name has a pretty heavy backstory. I was named after my dad, which caused constant confusion growing up, especially with things like insurance, bank accounts, and school forms. What I didn't know was that the decision to give me his name was made under very dark circumstances. I was born extremely premature at just 24 weeks back in 1987. When I was delivered, the doctor told my mom I had less than a 10% chance of survival. He coldly said something like, "We can either bury the baby with a name or without. We need space in the NICU for babies that have a real chance." Back then, medical technology was nothing like it is today. There weren't even proper ventilators for babies that small. The doctors had to manually modify equipment just to keep me alive, and oddly enough, some of those innovations contributed to the tech they use now. My mom couldn't stand that doctor. As soon as I was stable enough, she transferred me to another hospital because she didn't want to see him during rounds. I stayed in the NICU for about 6 to 7 months. The nurses there gave me a nickname, and I've used that name ever since. It's so different from my legal name that I always had to explain the story growing up. I didn't learn the full truth until I was 17. My parents hadn't told me sooner because of how dark it was. I knew I'd been in the papers and featured in medical articles as a success story, but I never knew why I was named after my dad. In a full circle moment, my own twins were born at 29 weeks in 2017. While they were in the NICU, one of the nurses who had cared for me decades earlier was still working there, and she ended up caring for my sons. She and my mom even recognized each other. It was surreal to see how life had come back around like that. Story 22. This one's not dark, just a little unsettling. As a kid, I used to spend Sundays with both of my great-grandfathers and my grandfather. They were all Finnish and spoke limited English, so my grandfather would usually translate. Sometimes they'd even let me have a little brandy and a smoke with them, very old-world style. They loved telling stories from their time in World War II. My grandfather would filter out the more intense parts when translating, but sometimes the full stories slipped through. They spoke with raw intensity about fighting Russians. Not just the usual soldier stories, these were stories of cutting off hands, removing tongues, and even putting enemy heads on fence posts. The hatred they carried, particularly toward the Russians, was fierce. One story I can't forget is when my great-grandfather described how he cut up a man's face and left him alive, so he'd carry the shame forever. He told that story like it was a badge of honor. They talked about Helsinki and how, if the odds had been 1 to 10, they still would have fought to the death. To them, one Finnish soldier was worth 15 Russians, even if reality didn't reflect that. It was wild hearing this as a kid. Despite how intense and sometimes disturbing their stories were, I still saw them as great men. But clearly, the war left scars that never healed. Story 23. My mom was nearly charged with her own mother's death. When my grandmother became very sick, none of her other children stepped up to care for her. So my mom did. She took care of her for over a year until she passed. The problem was that, according to medical records, my grandmother died earlier than expected. My mom, overwhelmed and unsure what to do, sat with her body for 3 days, unable to tell anyone. She just froze. Eventually, her coworkers got worried when she didn't show up for work, and my godmother asked the police to do a wellness check. When they arrived, they found my mom still sitting beside her mother's body. She was taken into custody, and for a while, it looked like she might face charges. Some of her siblings were convinced she had done something wrong and wanted her punished. The only person who believed in her was my godmother. In the end, my mom wasn't charged, but the experience left a deep emotional scar. She had to live with the grief of losing her mother, the shame of being accused, and the pain of being abandoned by her own siblings. Ironically, that experience led her to become a hospice nurse. Now, she spends her days helping others pass peacefully, trying to give them the comfort she struggled to provide her own mom. It's her way of making peace with the past. Story 24. I met my grandfather for the first time just last year, and he didn't hold anything back. He told me his entire life story, and it was way more intense than I ever expected. Before he met my grandmother, he dropped out of school in 6th grade and forgot how to read. He worked odd jobs until he was 18. When he tried to enlist in the military, he was rejected, which crushed him. He left home and went to New York City. There, he played guitar on the streets to make money. One night, after drinking too much at a strip club, he got into a fight at a bar. Someone pulled a gun on him, and when the guy turned away, my grandfather hit him over the head with a beer bottle. After that, everything went black. He woke up 3 weeks later in a hospital bed, having come out of a coma. Police were waiting for him. The man he hit had died, and my grandfather was charged with murder. He was in jail for 3 months before they reopened the case. After further investigation, he was cleared and released. It turned out the other man had been involved in several violent incidents himself, and new evidence proved my grandfather acted in self-defense. One of the wildest parts? My grandfather didn't learn to read until he was around 70. Hearing all of this from such a quiet, elderly man was surreal. I never would have guessed the life he'd lived. Story 25. My grandfather on my mom's side wasn't a good man. My mom shared her story with me, and it completely changed the way I see him. When she was a child, my grandfather pretended to be her uncle until she was about 5. That's when her mom finally told her the truth. He was her father. They lived in a big house. My grandfather had won a lot of money, and he used that to send his other children, from different relationships, to study abroad. But because my mom was white and female, he treated her differently. He refused to support her the same way he supported his sons. Even though they had a large house, my mom and her mother were confined to a single small room. As she got older, her uncles and aunts bullied her for being the daughter from another woman, even though her mother was officially married to him. She eventually married my dad, a soldier, just to get away and have someone who would protect her. Despite everything, when my grandfather grew old and sick, none of the other children cared for him. My mom was the only one who stepped up. In the end, he left most of his property to her, maybe as a way to make amends. She forgave him. But I can't. Every time I visit his grave, I can't bring myself to say a prayer for him. I respect that my mom found peace, but I still feel angry at the way he treated her growing up. Story 26. When my oldest brother was 19, everything in his life changed overnight. He suddenly broke up with his girlfriend of 6 years, moved out, and completely cut contact with our mom. Not long after, he moved to the other side of the world. No one would tell me why. Whenever I asked, I'd get the same answer. Ask him or her yourself. Years passed. I grew up, met someone, and my girlfriend became pregnant. That's when things started getting weird. My mom became unusually clingy, sometimes overly touchy, physically and emotionally. It made both of us uncomfortable, and we began distancing ourselves from her. Then my brother reached out for the first time in years. All he said was, "Don't let her near your girlfriend." That message sent chills through me. Later, my mom tried to convince me to leave my girlfriend, saying I needed to focus on my education, even though I had already dropped out of college to support our new family. Eventually, I started piecing things together. I learned that years ago, my brother's girlfriend had also been pregnant, and shortly after she told our mom, she suddenly lost the baby. That's when my brother left and never looked back. It hit me like a ton of bricks. My mom may have caused that loss, possibly on purpose, and it seemed like she might have been planning something similar with my girlfriend. I finally understood why my brother disappeared and why he was so insistent on warning me. It completely changed how I saw our mother. Story 27. My grandfather began dating my grandmother when he was 20, and she was just 13. Not long after they started seeing each other, she became pregnant. Her family kept the pregnancy a secret from him. One day, when he came to pick her up for a date, her family told him she'd been sent to live with cousins far away. He didn't know why and got angry, thinking she had ghosted him. So he gave up and didn't try to contact her again. That baby was quietly adopted by one of her cousins. A year later, my grandfather joined the military and was stationed abroad during World War II. Meanwhile, my grandmother returned home and began writing letters to him again. They reconnected, and after the war, they got married. By then, she was 17, and he was 24. They had 2 daughters together, and as far as anyone knows, my grandfather never learned about that first child. My grandmother passed away in 1996, and my grandfather lived well into his 90s. He never showed any sign that he knew the truth. I seem to be the only one who's figured it out. I once tried to bring it up to my mom, but she refused to listen. She didn't want her image of her parents, especially her mother, tainted by the complicated past they kept hidden. Story 28. This story is about my husband's grandfather, the man he and our son are both named after. The official family version was that he died after being hit by a drunk driver. That tragedy, they said, was why my husband's grandmother was always so bitter. They kept his memory alive as this kind, devoted family man. What I've since learned tells a different story. Through whispers from old family friends and a bit of small-town gossip, I discovered that the night he died, he was actually visiting his mistress. He hadn't been hit randomly. He had been leaving her house when the accident happened. His death may have spared the family a painful divorce. Instead, his wife, my husband's grandmother, kept the house, the land, and the family business. But her bitterness never faded. I don't know if it was grief or lack of closure, but it seemed to haunt her for the rest of her life. The strange part is how committed the family was to protecting his legacy. Most people in town knew the truth, but within the family, it was kept secret. Even my husband believed the fairy tale version of who his grandfather was, until recently. Ironically, the truth came out when my husband's mom started having affairs of her own. In trying to justify her actions, she let the truth about her father slip. It made me realize how much damage is done when families try to maintain perfect appearances instead of facing reality. Story 29. I'm a junior, meaning I have the exact same name as my dad, first, middle, and last. Back in the early days of internet searches, my friend decided to Google everyone in our group just for fun. Then he called me saying, "Hey, I found something weird with your name." He'd come across a website for people trying to reconnect with long-lost family. A woman was searching for my dad. It turned out that, while he was in the Navy, he had a brief relationship with a woman who worked in a questionable line of work. She had his child, and he never knew. The really strange part? This woman's daughter was only a few days younger than my oldest sister. At the time, my dad was going through a divorce and wasn't in the right headspace to reach out. A few years later, when he had remarried and settled down, the woman's daughter reached out again, this time through a family-finding service on MySpace. I passed the message along. Eventually, he did reach out. They met in person and now keep in touch. She's a nurse and has a daughter of her own. They don't talk often, but there's a respectful relationship between them now. It was an unexpected family twist, but one that turned out surprisingly positive. Story 30. All my life, I believed my grandmother was one of 4 daughters born to my great-grandparents. I never met them. They passed away before I was born, but their story seemed simple and wholesome. Then I found the family Bible. It had names, dates, marriages, and death records. That's when I noticed something odd, a 5th daughter, older than the others, listed by name. Curious, I asked my grandmother. She told me the truth. My great-grandfather had been married before. He had a daughter with his first wife, but she left him for a wealthier man, taking the child with her. My great-grandfather was heartbroken. Years later, that daughter reappeared, wanting a relationship. By then, he had already remarried and had children with my great-grandmother. But the reunion didn't go well. She constantly complained about money and treated everyone like they weren't good enough. Eventually, she left again, married into money, and was never heard from again. While digging further, I learned my great-grandfather was technically a junior, named after his father, who had abandoned the family when he was young. Years later, his father tried to come back, flaunting his wealth. But my great-grandfather refused to see him. He remembered the poverty and struggles his family endured and wanted nothing to do with the man who caused it. It's amazing how many stories and family truths you can uncover with something as simple as an old Bible. Story 31. My aunt, on my dad's side, recently found out something that completely shook her. She learned that she has a different father than her siblings. There are 5 sisters in total, plus my dad, and they all thought they shared the same parents. But it turns out she was adopted as a baby. Her biological mom had an affair with my grandfather, and when she became pregnant, he left her to be with my grandmother. My grandmother, wanting to raise the baby since she was technically her husband's child, convinced the biological mom to sign over her rights. The mother agreed, saying she didn't want to raise the child if she couldn't be with my grandfather. No one told my aunt any of this until my grandmother was on her deathbed. It came as a total surprise. But that wasn't the only twist. My grandfather had also fathered a son with another woman, an older woman, and no one in the family knew about this half-brother for over 35 years. Eventually, they discovered that he had already passed away, but he had a son. And here's the kicker. That son turned out to be my dad's boss. They only found out through a 23andMe test. My cousin took one, and so did my dad's boss. When my cousin checked his matches, he found the boss listed. That's when all the puzzle pieces fell into place. Now, my dad's boss is technically his nephew. It's wild how modern DNA tests can unravel secrets that were buried for decades. Story 32. My uncle was a college professor, well-liked by his students, with decent reviews online, some even commenting that he was charming despite being middle-aged and balding. But I never felt comfortable around him. Something always seemed off. One day, I was asked to deliver a birthday gift to him. We attended the same college where he worked, so it made sense. I knocked on his office door. He called out that it was open, so I walked in. Immediately, I noticed the room was freezing. I couldn't stop shivering. He was focused on his computer, barely acknowledging me. Then he said, "Come here and check this out." On his screen was a massive document full of familiar Reddit question prompts, things like darkest family secrets, worst advice you ever got, and interview horror stories. He looked at me with a smug grin and said, "Nobody knows this, but I post the same questions on Reddit every week. There's no real moderation for stuff like this, so it's easy karma." Then I sell the accounts to marketing agencies and start over. I was speechless. I left his office without saying anything. Later, I told a few people what I'd seen. Word spread around campus, and while he was never officially disciplined, students stopped signing up for his classes. His reputation quietly declined. I still hope one day he gets caught officially. Until then, I can't unsee that moment in his office. Story 33. I recently found out something that made me view my grandfather in an entirely new light. Something I haven't told anyone in the family, except for one cousin. My grandfather was one of the early major donors to political dark money schemes back in the mid-1990s. He worked with people like the Koch brothers to set up shell companies that funneled funds into political campaigns. In fact, he helped pour money into 26 Senate races. What he and a handful of others did back then helped lay the foundation for the massive campaign finance structures we see today. One of his biggest early beneficiaries was Senator Sam Brownback, who later became infamous for hurting Kansas's economy with extreme policies. My grandfather was one of Brownback's first supporters, working quietly behind the scenes. He was eventually fined $25,000 by the Federal Elections Commission, but he didn't seem to care. When I confronted him about it years later, hoping for some kind of regret or explanation, he just shrugged. He didn't acknowledge the impact of what he had done, not on politics, not on people. It's hard knowing that someone I grew up respecting played a role in shaping the political chaos we live with now, and doesn't seem to feel any responsibility for it.